Welcome to our Shaparency webinar series. Thank you for tuning in today to what is the last event for this year. Today's live webinar is the anatomy of a future director. The purpose of the webinars we host is to educate, inspire, and empower global leaders like you to help modernize boards and ultimately make boards more efficient. Our guest speakers bring leadership and board-related topics to the table, and shortly you will meet Paul Smith, and he'll shed some light on how the role of a board member must evolve to suit the contemporary world and become fit for purpose. My name is Red, Head of Events for Shaparency, and today's webinar moderator. Before we begin, let me introduce you to our webinar host, Shaparency. Shaparency is the world's most cost-effective and powerful board portal, and up to 80% less expensive than our competitors. World-class collaboration tools help future-thinking boards level up their digital processes. There's a steady stream of exciting new product updates to the platform at any given time. So if you haven't already, get your free 14-day trial and try it for yourself and for your board. 3 quick reminders before we begin. Write your questions in the Q&A section as we go. If we do run out of time to answer your question, we'll follow up with you after the webinar. Just make sure that you're not asking your question anonymously if you want to be contacted for this. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the video recording and the presentation slides within the next day or so. And a lot of people are upping their game right now to become a modern day board director through the globally recognized IBDC.D Board Education and Certification Program. Shaparency is a board education partner of IBDC.D. So attending the webinar today offers a CPE credit opportunity for certification holders. All right, here we are. I'm happy to present today's webinar speaker, Paul Smith. We won't be able to see him today because we had a little technical issue, but we will hear him and we will be able to follow his presentation. There is a lot to know about Paul. I'll give you a brief intro here, and I recommend connecting with him on LinkedIn following the webinar. Paul is the founder of Future Directors Institute. He has been described as a board futurist and one of the leading thinkers on what's next for board governance. Paul speaks around the world on the theme of board diversity, inclusive decision-making, and the concept and role of the future director. He is an award-winning author with his first book, Right Seat, Right Table, and is currently working on his second book, Leave Your Ego at the Door, a guide to impact and influence inside the boardroom. For over 10 years, Paul has served as chair and non-executive director for a number of companies and organizations in Australia, UK, and Europe. Here's Paul Smith and the anatomy of a future director. Welcome, Paul, to our virtual stage.
Thanks, Red. Thanks for having me, Shaparency. Lovely to be here. Sorry, I'm just a disembodied voice. We have, as Red said, we have a technical issue, but I am dialing in from Perth, Australia, and I'd love to know in the chat from all of you, where are you coming from? Tell me where in the world you are. Just a quick country while I just carry on with my introduction. It's really important for us to know where we are coming from and where we're at. And before I begin my presentation, which will go for about 25 minutes, I'd say what an honor it is to address to you all to do today. And thanks to Ben and Red and the team at Shaparency for hosting me. We have a very traditional start to events like this in Australia, and it's similar in different places around the world where we acknowledge and pay our respects to the traditional First Nation custodians of the land of which we hold events like this, even virtually. And despite my English accent with a slight Australian twang, I'm in fact coming to you from the beautiful and traditional lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people here in Perth. So I'd like to pay my respects, my deepest respects to their people past, present, and of course future, and thank them for their ongoing stewardship of the lands and waterways as well as their cultural influence. I'd also like to acknowledge and welcome any First Nations people to this session. That's a very traditional acknowledgement that we do in Australia. I'm not sure where you're all coming from all over the world. So before I dive in, I also want to give you a little bit of history of the future director. And I'd be using air quotes at this time, but you can't see them, so I'm not going to bother. When I started the Institute over 7 years ago, what we call FDI for short, I'll admit I had absolutely no idea about the future director. In fact, in our first year, we were called XY on boards, meaning we want to see younger generations, X and Y, bringing some much needed differing perspectives and skills into the boardroom. However, we learned more about who we needed to help. Within the first year, we changed to the Future Directors Institute. In this case, the future element meant becoming a director in the future, as we predominantly worked with those who aspired to the boardroom. However, over the subsequent years, we've come to look at the future director less as a destination, but more a definition of what it means to be a contemporary or modern director, regardless of age or tenure, the type of director the world needs now and into the future. And that is why the future director is actually a noun, as you can see from this one. So this is what we're here to discuss today. Who do we as board directors need to be in order to be fit for purpose, fit for the future, as well as the present? At a basic level, a future director is a self-aware, highly effective innovator. Obviously, it's more than this, and we are here today to explore this concept and hopefully debate it later on with your questions. You see, we are still actually exploring the evolving notion of the future director ourselves and plan to for years to come. But what I'll be presenting in this webinar is an attempted definition of the type of director our companies, organizations, and institutions and the world needs, and it comes in 7 parts. But first, let me start with the question, why do we need future directors? Aren't the current ones doing a wonderful job and are already fit for purpose? Many of them, yes. And in fact, you could say most of them could be with some changes, re-education, skills development, but perhaps mostly a mindset shift about the true nature of their role and who are they here to serve. However, there are a lot of pressures on the modern director. A recent survey of board directors by McKinsey showed that the time commitment of even the most adaptive boards had risen by 50% in recent years. That increase in time investment was expected to come down in 2021 to about 20 to 30%, but this was pre-COVID. And I think most of us could agree that overall the time pressures have stayed and are here to stay. We can no longer avoid being deeply engaged in the companies we govern, nor can we assume we know everything we need to know. The concept of the board member being whole and complete and there to give all their skills and experience and wisdom is over. And it's not just time, it's the greater risk, it's crises, more economic and ESG headwinds than ever before. There is greater transparency and demands on boards. The status quo will not cut it. Burnout is not just a worker phenomena, it's also the boardroom. The demands to maintain performance are really real. What else? Well, for a while now, every company has been a technology and a media company, regardless of what they do. Every business is awash with technology, from payment systems to accounting to social media. Most businesses have to also consider cybersecurity and digital accessibility, and for some it extends into blockchain, cryptocurrency, and even the metaverse. Outside the digital world, you have the normalization of ESG considerations, climate change, the increasing role of non-shareholder stakeholders, social license to operate, and many, many more. There are a multitude of new risks, new strategies to add to the existing pressures on this governing body and its members. Arguably, it's far more complex than ever before. So should we expect bigger boardrooms and more people to cope, or more well-equipped directors? Now, there's already enough evidence to suggest that optimal board sizes are not going to change. So we really need to change to come from the board and their directors. Before that though, before I talk about the traits of a future director and what it means, I wanted to quickly define something else, governance, or in this case, corporate governance. What is corporate governance? It's really interesting that there is no standardized definition that everybody agrees to. It's something that I've been exploring a lot with my contemporaries around the world. What do we really think governance, board governance, corporate governance is? Well, there is one definition that some people sort of draw back on, which is the structure of rules, practices, and processes used to direct and manage a company. It's a bit boring, and it's straight into very practical stuff. But for me and for many others, corporate governance is a much higher calling. It's about stewardship of the future, through great decision making and a great group of people. And so that's the definition I wanted to take forward, because it's actually related to the punchline of my story today, which is what is a future director? Well, the future director are the boardroom innovators. They are the one driving innovation inside the boardroom, new ideas, new techniques, new awareness. They are creating the conditions for effective stewardship and great decision making. And the creating the conditions is critical. It doesn't mean they are making all the decisions or that they're the chair or anything like that. It's all about their helping to create the conditions. Now, this is all well and good in theory, but in practice, future directors, by the simple definition, are rare. It's almost unobtainable 100% of the time that they can be doing this all the time. There's plenty of reasons for this, but the one most common for me is that we're all human beings. We are all unique, all flawed, and all uniquely flawed. And talking of flaws, like all boards, we have very limited time together, so I'm going to try and rush through this in my allotted time and get to the good stuff, which is the conversation and the questions at the end. And feel free to drop questions in as we go. Trying to distill down thousands of observations, anecdotal evidence, research, and more into a robust definition of a future director or a modern or contemporary director has been a really hard task, but it's sort of on brand for us, so I'm going to give it a go. I'm going to start my definition in reference to a great piece of work by these guys, Chip and Dan Heath. In their book, Decisive: How to Make Better Choices in Life and Work, they explore our collective decision-making weaknesses as human beings. They describe what they call the 4 villains of decision-making. Number 1 is narrow framing, which means not seeing enough of the picture and not asking the right questions. Number 2 is confirmation bias, which means only seeking out or favoring opinions from those that confirm your existing views. Did anybody say midterm elections? Number 3, short-term emotion. Instead of longer-term perspective, being proactive, not reactive. And overconfidence about the future is number 4. Sort of related to the Dunning-Kruger effect, if you're aware of that, a much celebrated but also maligned theory about the dangers of a little bit of knowledge. So if these are the enemies of good decision-making, we can start to counter these to create the first part of our traits of a future director. And this is number 1, that the future director is first a big picture thinker. This is the opposite to narrow framing. It's all about context. They seek out inputs from all stakeholders. A future director does this instinctively and attempts to be representative of all stakeholders as well. Boards must often make decisions that trade off the positive impact on one set of stakeholders with another. Shareholders over employees, the environment over customers, vice versa. In all of our consulting work at FDI and talking to colleagues around the world, it's a rare board that really truly understands and seeks out inputs from all of its stakeholders, let alone understanding the trade-offs and priorities they might need to create. As I mentioned in my punchline, a future director creates the conditions for effective stewardship and decision-making. So how does this first one do this? Well, being a big picture thinker brings to the boardroom more of a focus on impact, wider viewpoints, and in reality, a proactive approach. Most boards these days live in a reactive state because they don't see things coming or aren't prepared for the unknown. Great boards and great directors seek out to anticipate, or are better still, creating that future. If you think about stewardship, the word stewardship, it is steering the ship instead of just reacting to the winds and the waves around us. So this is the first trait. The future director is a big picture thinker. And how does the future director, who is a big picture thinker, impact the boardroom and the organization? Whilst not everyone has to think big, if we can look beyond the right now and see the wood for the trees, take the information we receive and seek out, and from it cast our eyes to the wider risks and strategies that may be possible, we can help the board navigate complex times and ultimately the organization from surviving to thriving. And these complex times, and you may have come across the phrase VUCA, leads me to trait number 2. This is actually originally going to be about being comfortable with these trade-off decisions. And if we think back to our widening view of stakeholders, many boards can get tied up in knots and are unable to make decisions because there's just too much ambiguity and uncertainty or too many trade-offs. In fact, you might not know if your decision is right for 10 years beyond your time on the board. So you want to have as much confidence as is justified, but detach from the need for validation. Therefore, you cannot expect perfection. You take the best direction with the best information you have. And again, that is stewardship. There's an old Native American saying about your responsibilities to plant the seeds of the trees that you won't sit under. And this is what this one is all about. So our second trait is the future director can be deliberately decisive in the face of ambiguity. Now, whilst the cycle of feedback loops are getting shorter and shorter, we still do not know the long-term systemic impacts of all the decisions that we might make as a board. So we still have to live by and large with the unknown, the ambiguity of our stewardship. And importantly, we shouldn't beat ourselves up if we don't get it right. This is the beauty of the definition of a future director. They always put in the efforts to make the best of what they have and support the board through this process, which is, I suppose, a nice segue to number 3 on my list, which hopefully you might be learning a brand new word, pronoia. This was an interesting one, and I wrestled with how best to describe it. But for me, it came down to putting positivity on something that became seen as a negative. In the boardroom, we can often be very, very risk focused, trying to protect the downside instead of maximizing the upside. Our job is often just to identify the roadblocks to any given strategy and then guide that ship around through or even remove those things that might impede the company or organization's future. This can lend itself to a group of people that prepare for the worst, but also expect it to happen. Now, there's nothing wrong with this from a risk management point of view, but for me, the future director is so well prepared and informed and helps the board do the same, as well as being comfortable with that ambiguity I just mentioned, that they are confident and trust that the best will happen. And this is called pronoia, the opposite of paranoia. There are many other elements to this characteristic. Building trust in decision-making is critical with each other, with management, with key stakeholders. Trust is critical. And if you actually remember what boards were called back in 200 years ago when they were invented as a corporate thing, they were called trustees. Trust is absolutely critical. Self-compassion, to forgive your mistakes and the flaws, and just as important in the boardroom, the compassion for others and their flaws as well. And you'll notice there's a lot of human skills rather than technical stuff that's coming through here. Some might call them soft skills. I tend to think I don't like the soft, hard stuff because the soft stuff is harder than the hard stuff. Being a better human is often harder than just learning a new technical trait. Good directors, like good leaders, must lead from the heart as well as the head in the modern world. If you think about most of the challenges facing any board, a good number of them are usually internal people challenges to go along with those external ones, which are often people challenges too. So our third trait is the future director builds trust, prepares for and expects the best. Now you might think that being pronoid makes a future director vulnerable to abuse of trust, but this is the innate strength of a future director, that they build relationships in such a way that they are the trusted ones, the ones that others seek out for their opinion. People love being around them as their positive energy can be infectious, but it's controlled and informed. There is a passion and a fire, but also logic and deep understanding. And this links quite nicely to that third villain of decision-making from the Heath's book, not being dictated to by short-term emotion. I remember on one of our education programs at FTI, we had a speaker called Dr. Kirsten Ferguson, who used to be the deputy chair of the ABC, which is Australia's national broadcaster. So, and she talked about the need to be dispassionately passionate to be a great board director. Bring the care, the passion, the fire, but know when to step back and look at things logically and without feeling. That's an art form and one that requires constant practice. If you've done any neuroscience research or behavioral training, you will know probably a lot about the system 1 and system 2 of the brain. In short, system 1 often brings the passion, the emotional response, the pure fire, while 2 is the logic and the rational. It's far more complex than that, but I wanted to give you a simple insight. But the best minds seek to blend those two in perfect harmony. And talking of the brain, this leads me to trait number 4. We are biasless. Now, that doesn't mean we are not full of bias. You can't avoid them. We all have them. It's more we are aware of our biases and we seek to limit their influence. As I said, we all have bias. It's how we live and cope with the phenomenal volume of inputs that our massive brains deal with on a daily basis. One of the biggest ones is that in the boardroom is that confirmation bias. Remember, that was one of the villains of good decision making, which is the tendency to search for, interpret, and focus on and remember information in a way that confirms one's preconceptions. Now, ironically, coming up with this list had me dripping in confirmation bias, but at least I was fully self-aware of it. I'm sure all of you have experienced confirmation bias. We do so on a daily basis. There are multiple other cognitive biases which involve or are types of confirmation bias. One is called backfire effect. This is where facts don't always change minds and in fact can reinforce one's own opinions. Or selective perception, one of my favorites, which is the process by which individuals perceive what they want to hear in a message while ignoring opposing viewpoints. So you can show two people with opposing views the same bit of factual information, and they will infer differing things from it. Now, selective perception is a broad term to identify the behavior all people exhibit, as we all tend to see things based on our personal frame of reference. And this is where the future director comes in. The future director is not immune from bias, but they are aware of these biases. They can spot them in themselves and in others, understand the consequences and the drivers when they come into play. They are also adept at quickly countering their own inherent biased human behavior, but equally adept at respectfully seeking the counter in others. You see, we all have that bias. We couldn't survive without it. If you want to get into that system 1, system 2 of the brain stuff that I mentioned beforehand, we talked about how humans are bombarded daily with millions of stimuli and bits of information. And if you're making massive decisions in the boardroom, imagine how these biases can impact your decision making, how you filter information. If we didn't have these filters, we wouldn't be able to survive and function. So we have to automate the process. Take RAS, for instance. This is reticular activating system, RAS. This helps your brain create connections and make things easier to remember. One of the most common occurrences of RAS is when you buy a new car. Once you buy that car, suddenly you start noticing that car everywhere on the road. Does this mean that everyone went out and bought the same car as you did? No, it just means that your brain has forged a connection with something it never cared about before. For example, if you're in a cafe and I come in and say your name, you'd probably turn towards me. If I don't say your name, I say another one. Your brain still hears it, but you are not conscious of the fact that the RAS filters it out because it's not information you need. So why do I say all this stuff? Why do I mention all of this stuff? Because a future director seeks to train their brain to allow certain things through that are more important than a new car or their name being called out in a cafe. A future director trains their brain because they understand their cognitive ability is what they are hired for. So the more you can train your brain to perform at a high level, and a part of that is becoming as free of bias as possible or aware of your bias as possible, the better a director you will be. So our fourth trait is the future director is aware of their biases. So how does the future director create a space for effective stewardship using this one? Well, this awareness usually leads to considered thinking and robust decisions. And that's going to be really helpful in the face of volatility and ambiguity. If the future director can bring this awareness to others and spark this element of self-governance in those around the table, then it will widen everyone's view. It will deepen our understanding of the information we receive. We will filter less out. We will filter less meaning out, meaning more will get through. The level of information a modern board member needs to process, and this is really important, is massive. And so if we can train our brain to filter in what's important, then and help the room do that, then everyone in the room will be more conscious of what is possible and the decisions we can make. Now, leading on from this, awareness is a slightly contentious trait. And that is and relates to and addresses the final villain of good decision making, overconfidence in the future. And it might come as a shock to you, but future directors have imposter syndrome. And this is a big but, it's what I call a healthy level of imposter syndrome, or healthy imposter syndrome. Now, high imposter syndrome is defined as the persistent inability to believe that your success is deserved or has been legitimately achieved as a result of your efforts or skill. Having presented this presentation a dozen times this year, I know that for some, the phrase imposter syndrome can be triggering, especially if you do not fit the traditional mold of a board director. But let's ignore the words and let's look at what I mean. Future directors are always exploring, always curious, always questioning their relevance. But they know the limits of this in terms of self-doubt. The healthy part of it is it's not a saboteur. It doesn't stop them from inputting into the governance process, but it does help inform them as much as it can help, to help in the process, because they are always asking why. So trait number 5 is the future director has a healthy level of imposter syndrome. And what does this cultivate in the boardroom? For me, the word here is humility. Future directors are humble, and this humility can impact the boardroom with openness to co-create and collaborate, not just with each other, but with all your internal and external stakeholders. In fact, I could have easily called this trait humility, because it's such an important one. Next up, I'm teaching you another new word, hopefully, unless you're based in New Zealand, ARCO. This curious questioning nature of a future director that I just described in their healthy level of imposter syndrome requires constant refreshment. And this is where number 6 out of 7 defining traits comes in. A future director is a lifetime learner, but that's not it alone. Future directors are not just about the learning, they're also about teaching. They are those people who are trusted and listened to, and so can coach, influence, and mentor others while accepting that they need that too. They focus on elevating others, not just themselves. Those that, like them, can inspire new thinking or activate a new strategy. When I first gave this presentation to a group of senior board members in New Zealand with the Institute of Directors over there, one of them told me of this word, ARCO. It's a Maori word, which is much better describing this trait than lifetime learner, lifetime teacher, which is what I used to call it. So ARCO means to both teach and learn, a reciprocal relationship where the educator is also learning from the student. Cross-mentoring is another way it can come across sometimes. ARCO refers to traditional thinking about the multi-directional transfer and absorption of skills, knowledge, wisdom, experience, much of which had traditionally occurred in the course of everyday activities. So like you are here today, instead of resting on your experience or perhaps any letters after your name that you've gained, you seek out learning opportunities throughout your career. And maybe you'll take this information you learned today or through any of the Shaparency webinars and take it back and try to teach other people, not in a preachy way, but in a helpful way. You are hopefully detached from the status quo, the way things have always been done, not because the past ways are always wrong, but you don't assume that they'll always be right. So our 6th trait is the future director is a learner and a lifetime teacher, ARCO. Now imagine a boardroom, a hierarchy-free, peer-based collective of learners and teachers working with each other and their stakeholders to effectively steward an organization. For the boards they sit on, a future director brings a virtuous cycle of improvement, a growth mindset, and performance enhancements. This will lead to actions like continuous self-evaluation, support for one another, and formal training schedule, tapping into all the resources available. Unfortunately, too few boards focus on training development of their directors. It's often left up to the individual, self-directed if required at all. As I mentioned, we need to really finally realize that the days of being whole and complete as directors as we enter the room are over. There is too much changing in the world for us to maintain the status quo. And talking of shadowing the status quo, this brings me to the final trait, shattering. And this is what the future director is doing. They're shattering expectations by being what I call constructively disruptive. I'll just let that sink in for a bit. Constructively disruptive. What the hell does that mean? To be disruptive in a so-called childlike sense is to disturb the order, bring chaos, be unruly. I'm sure we can think of some adults that act like that too. Yes, it's to break the rules, the established order of things, and it's seen as negative. However, in a business sense, To be disruptive is to be groundbreaking and innovative, and this is seen as a positive. For a future director, it means both. It means confidently saying no when everyone else is saying yes. It means standing up for something different and not being afraid to try to do something new in the boardroom. You see, the future director not just thinks of and researches the ideas that will help effective stewardship, they express them too, but not in a childlike disruptive manner. They do it with respect, with preparation, with patience, and with care, and always being constructive. So our final trait is the future director is constructively disruptive. And for the board that a future director sits on, they will bring new ways of thinking, new techniques, new ways of working that we can try and test to see what is fit for purpose. Future directors are the boardroom innovators. Ultimately, the future director is helping to shape the future board by creating those conditions for effective stewardship, good decision making, and leaving things in a far better place than they found them, pretty much how we should live our lives. Now, it's not a role for everyone that everyone can take on or even needs to. Not everybody needs to be a future director. A room full of boardroom innovators, future directors, might just be a little bit too much, but every board needs at least a few, and potential with the added trait of 8 being a wonderful facilitator of people. So if we're also a future director and a wonderful facilitator of people, they might just make the perfect chair. And before I come to an end, I want to summarize, before I come and summarize the 7 traits, and we move on to a little Q&A, here are some quick extra thoughts of what could have been included or sort of are in there but unnamed. For me, curiosity, everything starts with curiosity. And I mentioned curiosity beforehand. A curious director is a self-aware director. They are the big picture thinker. They seek out collaboration, they evaluate, they learn. And like Simon Sinek said, it starts with why. Equanimity is another of my favorite words. It's to be calm in a crisis. And wow, have we had a few years of crises where many boards have been left wanting. But I felt this was sort of implied in how prepared a future director is and how they are more proactive than reactive. And therefore, when a crisis comes, they don't go running around like a headless chicken. Communication by a future director is not just them talking. It's actually about listening, active listening, not to respond, but to learn and to understand. Hence the 2 ears and 1 mouth. Courage, you cannot be a future director without being courageous, especially the self-investigation or self-governance. It takes a very brave soul to go inside and dig deep and look at your biases and your imposter syndrome. It also takes a brave person to challenge the assumptions of those around them, the status quo, or even the information they are receiving from other sources. The penultimate one is almost impossible. It's about leaving your ego at the door. In modern English, ego has many meanings. It could mean one's self-esteem, an inflated sense of self-worth, the conscious thinking self, or in philosophical terms, oneself. Ego development is known as the development of multiple processes, cognitive function, defenses, and interpersonal skills, or to early adolescence when ego processes are emerging. So stripping away its definition, what would I in reality do I mean by this? It means putting aside all the stuff that you have that filters everything before you step into the room. Self-interest, personal agendas, politics, dogmatic beliefs, the need to be right all the time, those pesky biases, even, and I kid you not, hangriness. It means managing yourself, calling it self-governance, putting aside what I call your boardroom baggage. I told you it's almost impossible. And finally, future directors have no barriers to exit. We spend so much time focused on barriers to entry for new and diverse directors, different thinkers with different skills. But the barriers to exit are often much more significant as you have directors passively hanging around longer than they should and passive boards letting them do it. A future director knows when to step away because they leave things in a better shape. But thanks to that healthy level of imposter syndrome, they won't second guess their value too much and step away too early. So quickly summarizing, the future director is a big picture thinker. They are decisive in the face of ambiguity and uncertainty and volatility, that VUCA world. They prepare for and assume the best. They are aware of their biases and they actively work to reduce their impact. They have that healthy level of imposter syndrome. They are a lifetime learner and teacher, ARCO, one of my favorite words. And they can be and try to be constructively disruptive. Thank you very much. That is my presentation. Before I hand quickly to Red, just some quick reflective and challenges and questions for you to think about as we move forward. 1, how do you feel about this list? It's ever evolving. You don't have to agree with all of it. I don't expect you to. Do you feel like you are a future director by this definition? If you're not, where do you think you are lacking? How would you even begin to measure the quality of a director and even label someone effectively a future director? Can a future director only be a full-time professional director? Where will future directors come from? And how will the future director evolve over the next 10 years? That's enough for me. I hand to Red. Hopefully we'll have some questions.
Really great, Paul. This opened up some thoughts for even myself, and I'm sure for our audience. Really, really cool way to think of things. I do have questions, so I'm going to jump right into them. Trey is asking, I'm curious, if the future director leaves ego at the door, what trainings are you aware of that assist directors to actually experientially practice these qualities in brave space?
It's a great question, Trey. So I would go to all the behavioral scientists and neuroscientists out there who offer leadership training based around this understanding of how the brain works. I think the more you can train yourself to understand how the brain works and how we make meaning out of everything and how we filter information in order to live our lives, the more you become self-aware of everything that's going on. As I say, bias is a part of everyday life. You're not going to rid yourself of them, but you can, the more understanding and labeling you can bring to things, the more you can interrupt a thought process or a decision that you're doing or reaction. And so I would always go to those neuroscientists, those neuro leadership, those behavioral scientists who are putting on training. In Australia, for example, if you are here, there's a group called Neuropower Group who are partners of ours who do this amazing leadership intensive course where they bring as much awareness to this stuff as possible. And that's where I got trained, where I started my training on this stuff.
Great. How are the stresses of COVID and all the extra hours that boards are putting in impacting the ability to perform at high level? Surely it's too much.
It is. It's way too much. We cannot expect our board directors to live up to high standards constantly. Even if they're getting paid a fortune, we can't expect perfection from board directors. Burnout is real. And what you're starting to see is people stepping away from roles because they can't cope with having too many board roles, because there's times, the stresses, the energy that it sucks from people, especially if it's not the best environment or culture within the boardroom. People are going, I'm stepping away, and there may be conflict because it might be part of their earnings as well. So I think the unintended consequences of all this is going to be, you're going to have people with taking on fewer roles because the time commitments are there, and they also want to maintain their energy levels and their cognitive levels because they can't make mistakes. Because if they make even the slightest mistake, you know, we're turning into a more litigious society, and they've got institutional shareholders and other shareholders and governments and regulators waiting there in the wings. And so you can't spread yourself too thin. That's going to leave a vacuum. That's going to leave a vacuum which people are going to have to fill. And therefore we'll need to broaden what we mean by a qualified director. So even just the fatigue that's coming from this very volatile and pressured world that we're in, the boards are feeling just like anybody else. There's going to be a whole bunch of unintended consequences that's going to lead to more and more challenges. And I don't think even with COVID, you know, we're not through COVID. If it's not this, it's something else. It's something else which is disrupting this well laid out path we might have put our company through.
Thank you. And Glenn is asking, in your experience, how many, as a percentage, boards and board directors have you seen lately that display those 7 traits?
It's a great question, Glenn. It's low. It is low, but I did say up front it was an almost impossible thing to do. So can I express it as a percentage? It's really interesting. A lot of the clients that come to us, the people come to us, they have this sort of innate learning mindset. So they're more likely to display far more of these traits because there's this curiosity in them, this to continue learn, and that's whether that's a board or otherwise. You know, we do board evaluations, what we call health checks. They think of a doctor doing a checkup of a body, and then we tell you how to reduce your cholesterol and improve your whatever. And what we found is the ones who come to us want to seek out that information. So they're not the ones who, they're the ones who are self-aware, and so they're already operating a high level. They're looking to go higher. So it's the ones who don't evaluate, they're the ones that are in trouble, because they don't have that innate learning mindset that we need to do something to continuously improve. So it's a low percentage. I'd say in my experience, it's less than 10, unfortunately, that display all 7 traits.
And hopefully this is going up because of you, Paul, now with this message.
All I can do is talk about it and try. That's all I can do, Red.
And sometimes that's what it takes.
And I also, having said that though, this is the thing. I think the more people we can have in the room that think in even these terms, that we can't keep on doing the same thing, that will apply some internal pressure. It might take a generation, but also, you're welcome, Glenn, by the way. Also, you have increasing external pressures. As I mentioned, you've got greater transparency being demanded on the boardroom, greater reviews of their performance and what they're up to. And so they can't hide. And yes, the unfortunate side effect of that is that, you know, everybody's minutes are now up for open use in the court of law, whether it's government commissions or investigations or through shareholders and other stakeholders. But that just drives greater diligence. That's what it should do, as opposed to pushback. But, you know, it's a fluctuating time, so it's going to take a lot of time for boards to evolve to where they need to be, unfortunately.
Yes. How can board members start having this conversation about this topic? How can this be addressed in the boardroom when many may be reluctant or resistant to the conversation?
It's a really good question. And often it will just take one person that needs to ask the question, how are we doing? You know, how are we actually doing as a board? How are we performing? Often, as I mentioned beforehand, there's this notion that boards and the board members have to be whole and complete. You know, the best ones will self-evaluate, and they will do that on a constant basis, and so will the individuals. And I think the first part is just to open the question and say, hey, let's actually just check in and go, are we actually achieving what we want to achieve as a board? One of the things we do with our clients often is we say, you know, you can do this at the end of every board meeting or every committee meeting and actually ask some very simple questions. Did we achieve what we wanted to achieve? Are we heading in the right direction? You can make up your own questions, just little self-reflections. And that's the thing where you can start, is just by entering into the conversation of just inquiring, do we think we're doing a great job? Now, depending on who else is in the room with you, you might get pushback and say, yeah, of course we're doing a great job. You can go back and go, well, how are we measuring that we're doing a good job?
Yeah, perfect. And Scott is asking, excellent list, or telling you, excellent list. Does this supersede the need for specialized skills? And have you found any tools that help one determine their baggage?
I'd probably refer to the second part, Scott, to my answer to Trey's question about training your brain and seeking out that stuff. Again, it's just putting in little practices that will help you perform at a high level. So understanding and labeling what could stop you. There's a whole bunch of different tools out there and training out there. Two things I like is one's Gallup Strengths, which helps you identify what your natural talents are and labels for them. So you can always come back to these and what I do really well. Another one I really love is one called Saboteurs. It's by a group called Positive Intelligence, which I have no affiliation with. It's a free, this one's free, and it identifies the things that can stop you. And this is part of your baggage. And these are things that can stop you. You might be a people pleaser, or what's called hypervigilant or hyperachiever, where the things that might stop you is like, I just need to do a whole bunch of tasks as opposed to sit back and think big, or hypervigilant, which is one of my saboteurs, where I'm always thinking, but what if this, that, and the other, which is great in the boardroom to a certain extent, but often you can overdo them. People pleaser and other things like that. There's a list of, I think, 9 of them. And it's, again, what it does is that this just provides you with a label and awareness of these things. So when it shows up, the more you train and practice, think about Atomic Habits, a fantastic book about creating little incremental improvements in everything that you do, those compound into massive improvements. Another simple thing is, I'm sure all of you do virtual meetings. You're all here on a virtual webinar, but if you're in the boardroom, you might have virtual sessions. Often we find that people will switch from one meeting to another without a buffer. Whereas in the old days, you might walk to a board meeting, etc. So I think there's a bit of that other question I haven't answered as well, first of all. But so I would say that create these buffers, the simple tool, create a buffer between virtual meetings, allow you to prepare yourself mentally and cognitively, because essentially that's what you're there for. You're there for your brain. You're there for the way you think. I think the other question there that Glenn had was about, does this list supersede the need for specialist skills? No. So
Yes.
this list very much focus on the human skills side of things, the human traits side of things, rather than the need for technical skills and experiences. And those are, as you point out, Glenn, increasingly becoming specialized. We used to have boards full of specialist generalists, so you're across everything. And you still need to be there, but with the way the world is, you also need people who are specialists. So you get things called generalist specialists. You need to be across financial governance and strategy and risk and compliance and all that sort of side of things, but you might have a specialism in technology or innovation or climate change, depending on, or marketing or HR, depending on the group and the need of the board.
Perfect, and thank you. And I will add, you spoke a little bit about positive intelligence and the saboteurs there. We did have a webinar on this topic. I believe it was in April of this year by David Beal, speaking just about what you just brought up.
Fantastic.
So great.
On the same wavelength.
Yes. Trey is also asking another question. I have a sense of the qualities of the individual board member, and I'm grateful for your overview. I'm wondering, though, how much do you see ability to work collectively, collaboratively, instead of from a competitive mindset to be important?
Inside the boardroom, it's everything. I think competition of ideas is healthy, but you have to have a really good culture for that to happen. So working collectively and collaboratively is important, but within that, there's going to be a competition of ideas and different perspectives. That's the nature of a diverse and inclusive board, is you want that. I can't remember who it was, but there's a relatively famous chair that once said, if my board, and he called it my board, which I don't agree with, but let's go with it. If my board ever agree unanimously on a big decision, we don't make that decision. We have to go back and actually come up with counterpoints, because we are often working too closely together and we're not getting a competition of perspective and ideas. So I think it's a blend, Trey, between the two. My pleasure.
Great. And then we have, I believe, one more question here before we have to go. What other changes to the role of the board director do you foresee over the next 10 to 20 years?
Oh, I have absolutely no idea. I think what I'm presenting here, as we've already seen, is relatively rare. So I think what we're seeing here is going to become far more common. I think you're going to get boards who are I think what we led is the more likely it's not so much the evolving nature of the director themselves, but more the evolving nature of the role and responsibilities of boards as well, and their makeup. Interestingly, there are multiple models of governance out there. There's not just one that everybody follows. In the West, we tend to have the traditional Western model, which is a singular fiduciary board and maybe some subcommittees. Japan has a thing called enterprise governance, where everybody's involved in the governance process. And then you have the German or European model, where you have a two-tiered governance structure. And then there's a whole bunch of different models of people creating whatever they need to create. And I think this is where you'll start seeing some evolution, is not only the role and responsibilities of boards will shift as they become more open to the world. This group that has often operated within closed doors, they'll have to sort of be a bit more transparent about who they are and what decisions they're making. Obviously, you know, you have public companies that aren't like this, but we're talking about private companies and listed companies. And then that will have a knock-on effect to the type of people who are in the room. There's lots of schools of thought in this, and it could go either way. You might have to have increasing size boards because of all those specialist skills that come in. And then you'll really need a shifting change in who is chairing the board, because they become that great facilitator as opposed to potentially the most senior person in the room. They have to get the best out of all these groups of people who think very differently. Having a diverse board is great, but creating an inclusive culture is really, really important. Or you might go the other way, where you actually see a shrinking of the boardroom to like a small group of specialists or decision makers who can guide a much larger substructure, because there's too many decisions, too much information that's being taken. You could see boards go the way of the dodo, because you start seeing democratized decision making and decentralized organizations. Who knows? 20 years is a long time these days, and you never know. AI in the boardroom, our roles may be completely superseded by some sort of singularity. All these predictions can go, I think that one's a bit of a sci-fi one, but I think technology is going to start playing an even more critical role in the boardroom. At the moment, technology plays a role in terms of managing board business, like I'm not doing this to plug Shaparency. I think what you'll start seeing is more machine learning in the boardroom, helping to actually make decisions by crunching information, whether it's more compliance-based decisions rather than, you know, the ones that need human intuition.
Perfect. And thank you very much, everyone, for great questions, and to Paul for great answers to these questions. I think we're ready to plop in the farewell slide. So I'm going to give you a few other things here for you. So for further information about Shaparency and to take advantage of that 14-day free trial, the test drive, you go to Shaparency.com and you can pick it up right there. No credit card required. To enroll in a global board education and certification course, the IBDC.D, and up your game to modern day board director, you visit shaparency.com/boardeducation. And to go to shaparency.com/events is where you find upcoming events. As I mentioned to you, we are taking a break from our webinars during the months of December and January, and we'll be back again in February with some great events and exciting speakers. Thanks for everyone for tuning in today. And thank you again, Paul, for spending some time with us also. From me and the entire Shaparency team, have a great rest of your day and see you soon. Bye now.